Okay, so we've moved just a little bit further towards the city centre from where Ewan introduced this to us in terms of the tour and talking about the history of the university. And this, where you'll come to stand, this quad is in a development called Horse Guards. And we'll talk about the origin of the development in a little while. But the first thing to note is, as Ewan has said, Exeter is kind of defined by this topography of high ridges divided by deep valleys, each of which has a stream which goes down towards the River Exe. So in order to get to the city centre and beyond it, you have to go up and down these ridges, which is what gives to the city today its contemporary topography. Now, the reason we're talking about that here is because that's actually particularly significant when we think about the city's water supply and the history of how people have tried to use water in the past. If you were to go a little bit towards my left, probably about 200 to 300 yards, there is the first city reservoir that was used in the 1840s when the first pumping station for treated river water was built about 1.5 miles north of here at Pines, and you'll hear more about the history of that in the tour of the underground passages when you go on it. When that water treatment works was constructed, they needed to pump that treated water up to a high enough point above the city so that enough water pressure would be generated so that most of the city could be supplied with potable water to each of the houses in Exeter. So it was decided that they would build a reservoir, which is still used today as a transit reservoir at Danes Castle. Danes Castle is actually named after a siege which occurred in 1838 when King Stephen was trying to take the city back from some rebels, and the earthwork still exists today, and so the reservoir was built within that enclosure. So this particular area, because of the topography, because of the need to gain water pressure, has been particularly significant in the context of the city's water supply, which will form, as you know, part of the basis for the assessment for this term of the module. So let's say something about where we are now in Horse Guards. Well, Ewan's already panned around the camera to show you some of the buildings in this area. The buildings actually directly behind me at the other end of the quad, those are modern buildings, but either side, and indeed behind where we're filming now, these are much older buildings, and this whole complex was built as a result of the threat that was perceived from Napoleon in France in the late 1700s. This was constructed in 1798 as the higher barracks, and the idea of the higher barracks was that if there was an invasion, it was inevitably going to come across the channel. You needed large numbers of men, large numbers of troops to be easily accessible to the sea to defend the country. And indeed, of course, Exeter at that time was a very, very busy port, as we'll see later on the film, and therefore it was really necessary to provide some defence to the city. And again, one of the highest parts within the city limits was chosen as a way, again, of gaining some strategic advantage. Now, at the end of the 1990s, the army decided that it would vacate these premises. It would relocate most of its troops down to Wyvern Barracks, which is nearer the River Exe, to the south of the city centre. Then the big question you've got, which is something we see a lot of in this country, is what happens to space within already developed metropolitan areas when a particular industry, or in this case the military, vacate those premises. Now, traditionally, the model has always been, certainly since World War II, that we demolish everything that was there before, we start again, and we use the most up-to-date techniques to build housing estates, retail developments, or other kinds of developments. What was undertaken here in Horse Guards in the early 2000s, the first decade of the 20th century, is really quite interesting. Because rather than starting again, rather than building traditional houses that if you go to any other development to the east of Exeter, you'll see these very tiny houses on small plots of land, very car dependent. which of course increases the propensity of people to use those cars to commute long distances and so on. The idea in horse guards was to say, can we use the existing assets, the fabric of the buildings, the natural environment, the trees, of even here, the quad, which was of course the military parade ground, can we use those to create a much nicer place for people to live, a place that is much less dependent on motor vehicles? So you can see here, this is a pedestrianised environment. There are motor vehicles around, but their use is discouraged, and they've also been kind of hidden away. They're not within the consciousness so much. So for example, the area you'd have walked past on the left as you walked into the quad, those were old stables. They of course now are parking garages, but the cars are out of sight. So redeveloping areas like this is trying to promote particular ways of living in the city, which are much more about sociability, pedestrianisation, lower levels of personal mobility, particularly reliance on the motor car. It's about making cities vibrant again, because as we'll go on to talk about in the city centre, immediately after World War II, after the Blitz, the bombing of Exeter, Exeter was remodelled around the car, the idea that people would use the motor car to come in and out of the city, but they wouldn't live in the city. So horse guards is a really revolutionary idea which began in the United States, an idea called New Urbanism, which is to try and attract people to come and live back in the city. So on the next stage of your walk, you'll walk kind of around the quad to behind me on my left. You'll wend your way down past the prison, and then we'll pick up the filming again as we look from at the prison from across the valley at the bottom of the castle mount.